All right, we're going to pick back up with the concept of motivating operations. So what are motivating operations? These are going to be changes in the environment that alters the effectiveness of some stimulus or event as reinforcement and simultaneously alters the momentary frequency of the behavior that has been followed by that reinforcement. All right, that is a big chunk of words. What does that actually mean? It means that establishing operations have two major effects. They increase the momentary effectiveness of reinforcement, and they increase behaviors that produce that reinforcement in the past. So a simple example of this is that if there have been behaviors that have been reinforced with food, then the time since you last ate will serve as a motivating operation that will increase the value of food as a reinforcer because you're hungry. It's been a particular period of time since you've last ate. And it will increase behaviors that have previously produced food in the past. So if that is going to be sitting or begging or some other kind of behavior, that's going to increase those kinds of probabilities if they have been reinforced in the past using food. Motivating operations can be more general than just food or through just delays of being hungry or duration since you last ate. Another potential example of this that you might have experienced yourself is, have you ever, someone asked you, do you want lunch? And you're like, no, I'm fine. I don't want anything. So then they go ahead and make some food, sit next to you, and then you start smelling it. And then all of a sudden, as you start smelling it, you are all of a sudden very hungry, and you are like, oh, I want some of that, and I am going to either ask for that or get up and go make that food. That would be an example of the smell of that food being a motivating operation. It temporarily increased the effectiveness of that food as a reinforcer, going from no, I don't want any, or I don't want to make my own, to getting up and making it, and increasing the behavior that has led to getting food in the past. So establishing operations can be a variety of different kinds of methods. Probably one of the most common one is going to be some type of period without the reinforcement. So some type of deprivation level, which will be, I had breakfast a couple of hours ago, so now I'm starting to get hungry. Or it could be that I haven't had my toy in 20 minutes or an hour or something like that. These are all going to be factors that sort of establish some type of reinforcer as increasing its effectiveness in that momentary time. So when we're considering, is a dog motivated by something, we can better or look at, well, what are the establishing operations in place? What are the things that have made this a valuable reinforcer? Like, when was the last time they've had access to it? How often do they have access to it? As well as other things like, can they access it? And is it a strong reinforcer to begin with? And we'll talk about trying to identify stronger, weaker reinforcers in just a minute. But nonetheless, an establishing operation are going to be those procedures that establish the effectiveness of a particular type of reinforcer and how effective that's going to be. So what is the difference between the establishing operations and the discriminative stimuli that we've been talking about? Well, discriminative stimuli, remember, predict the availability of reinforcers. They don't necessarily change the motivation for that reinforcer. So for example, if you don't bring your toy pouch, then that would be an S delta, or a signal that reinforcement is not available. And if they don't engage in a behavior, it's not because they're not motivated for the toy, it's just that they have recognized that the toy is not available because it's not there, right? So that is indicating the availability of the reinforcer, not changing the actual motivation for that reinforcer. Whereas establishing operations, on the other hand, they make those reinforcers more valuable. So they make the consequences function as reinforcers. So that would be something like, I've taking the toy away, even if it's just for 10 seconds from the last time that they've had it. That would be an example of an establishing operation. Or perhaps things like, getting the dog or petting the dog so that they're engaging with you, ready for that toy, or moving the toy in such a way that it engages a strong response from the dog. These are all making that toy more valuable or higher reinforcing, these are establishing operation procedures. They're not necessarily telling the dog whether that toy is available or not. That would be a discriminative stimulus. Importantly, EOs and SDs or S deltas can have similar kinds of looking effects on dogs, which is why it's actually kind of important to try and separate them, because they do lead to different types of changes in your behavior to better sort of maintain a stronger performance. So what would be an example of this? So an example of this could be, say you have a dog that is searching for an odor, target odor. They're searching for a really long period of time and they haven't found anything. So there's no target odor in that particular environment, and they're going from one area to another area and there's nothing there. And you can see that the dog is starting to sort of show what we would say lower levels of motivation. And actually, that's not really lower levels of motivation, as I'm about to explain, but you'll start seeing that they are getting distracted. They're not searching, they're not sniffing as much. So we might say they're not motivated, but really what's happening is that they have built up what we call an S delta, or that extinction stimulus, right? They have learned that in this area or in that period of time, they are learning that reinforcers are not available, or target odors are not available. Things are not available, so it doesn't make sense to engage in behaviors for finding target odors if target odors aren't available. It's just not present. It would be like going to, like a home goods store or going to a Home Depot to find, I don't know, bread, right? You can search as much as you want in Home Depot to get bread, but you're not going to find the bread there. You would learn that the bread is just not available there. That doesn't change your desire that, say your family has asked you for bread, that you need to go get bread. You're still motivated to get the bread. I really want that bread. It's just not available in the Home Depot, right? You've got to go to a different kind of store for that. So the S delta in that case is just indicating that that reinforcer is not available, although your behavior will look like I'm not finding anything and I'm giving up, because you're looking through the Home Depot aisle by aisle and not finding anything. Your decline of search behavior is going to be because you're learning that bread is just not available there, even though you want bread just as much. So your establishing operation is still in place. You're still motivated for that reinforcer. You're just learning that that reinforcer is not available, which would be the SD example. Alternatively, an EO kind of example would be, say, for example, you were just playing for 20 minutes with a particular type of toy, or you were using food and the dog is now satiated, and they might be satiated from that particular kind of toy. Or say, for example, you forgot a toy that is a higher value toy, and instead of using a piece of rope, and you give the dog the rope a couple of times, and now they are satiated with that rope because they're not as motivated for that particular type of toy. Even though you have plenty of target odors in the environment, plenty of things to search, they will then show slow search, easy distraction, same kind of looking behavior, but it's not because that they have learned that they're not target odors available or there aren't reinforcers available for engaging in search behavior. It's just that they've learned that they don't want the consequence for finding that target odor because they're not motivated for that, or there wasn't the appropriate establishing operation. So similar looking behaviors, but two totally different causes, which means that in one case, you would need to change things about the availability of the reinforcers, whereas in the second case, you would need to change what your reinforcer is or how you've established that as a reinforcing tool or reinforcing item. So that's why it's important to try and separate these two, is because they do lead to actually very different kinds of approaches on how to change a behavior that may not be desirable. So then, going off of that, how do we identify what might be a reinforcer or not for your dog? How can we sort of predict what is going to be a stronger reinforcer for one dog versus a stronger reinforcer for another dog? And ultimately, the only way to be 100% sure whether stimulus will serve as a reinforcer or punisher for that matter is to actually see, does behavior increase or decrease following its contingent presentation on a particular behavior? But other than actually doing a reinforcer test, are there any ways that we can kind of predict to some degree whether something would serve as a reinforcer? And that's where the Premack principle comes in. And the Premack principle is relatively simple. It assumes first that reinforcers are behaviors rather than stimuli, meaning that the food itself is not the reinforcer. It is eating is the reinforcer. So behavior is the reinforcer for something, not the actual stimulus per se. And that you can determine the probabilities of several behaviors. And behaviors in a sort of free operant situation, meaning that you can choose between a variety of whatever behaviors without anything kind of interfering with that. More probable behaviors will reinforce less probable behaviors. So a simple example of that is if it's more probable that a child will eat ice cream than Brussels sprouts, then it indicates that we can reinforce Brussels sprout eating by allowing a child to eat ice cream contingent on Brussels sprout eating. Basically meaning that if you have a plate full of food in a free operant situation and the child always chooses ice cream and eats the ice cream and has a low probability of eating Brussels sprouts, then that means that if we wanted to increase them eating Brussels sprouts, we could sort of set a contingency that if you eat 2 Brussels sprouts, then you can have ice cream, right? Which is a typical kind of parenting move. Whereas alternatively, we couldn't do the opposite. We couldn't say, eat 2 bites of ice cream and then you can have Brussels sprouts. That it might actually serve in a reverse session as a punishing type of situation, where if you eat 2 bites of ice cream, then you have to eat a Brussels sprout. So, but nonetheless, what this highlights is that you can somewhat predict what things will be more reinforcing versus less reinforcing by evaluating what the animal will do in a free operant kind of situation and seeing what are going to be things that are high probable and what are things going to be low probability, and then arranging things in different kinds of contingencies so that if they engage in one low probability behavior, they get access to do a high probability behavior. And the original work from this came actually with rats. And essentially what they did is that they deprived the rodents with different behaviors, so either access to drinking or access to running on a wheel. So if you deprive of drinking, the most probable response when you then have access to water is going to be drinking. If you were deprived of running on a wheel, then the most probable response when you have access to that wheel is going to be going for a run. And what they found is that if you do different reinforcement tests, you can actually reverse the relationship between what will reinforce which based off of what is the most probable response. So in the deprived of drinking situation, you can reinforce drinking via running, basically meaning drinking would reinforce running, so that they would have to run a couple of steps on the wheel to get access to water, so then you can increase the rate of running by getting access to drinking. Whereas you can get the opposite if you were deprived of running, that running will then reinforces drinking, meaning that you have to run or you have to drink a little bit so that you can get access to the running wheel that would unlock the running wheel. So drink, 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 then you can run a little bit as the reinforcer so that you can actually flip and rotate these different types of what's more reinforcing from the other based off of what is the most probable response. So what is sort of the takeaway from this is that more probable behaviors can reinforce less probable behaviors. So this gives you another type of tool for identifying what are going to be reinforcers for your dog in a different scenario that are going to be other than your traditional toy or playing with a toy or food. What this indicates is that some behaviors that your dogs have a high probability of engaging in are going to be things that are going to serve as reinforcers for less probable behaviors. But you can't reinforce a high probable behavior with a less probable. Essentially, you have to go from something that they are very likely to do as the reinforcer for a less probable behavior. So a simple example is that if you want your dog to walking to heel, and you can look at what are going to, what does my dog do in just a free operant situation? They might walk next to you into heel with a very low probability, but if there was a toy around, they would probably engage in toy play with a very high probability. And what this would suggest is that if we arrange the consequences such that the more probable behavior serves as the reinforcer for the less probable behavior, access to toy play if you walk next to me would likely be sort of a winning solution, in the same way that making ice cream contingent on eating your Brussels sprouts would work with a child. The same here would work with the Premack principle. So it's just another way to give you a tool to try and predict what would be an appropriate reinforcer relationship between different kinds of behaviors. And basically what it says, when you boil it down, is that look at what your dog allocates its time towards if they were to have a choice between different things. And things that it allocates most of its time towards are going to be things that are going to be strong reinforcers that you can then use to increase behaviors that it doesn't allocate as much time towards. And then with that, we will move on to behavioral chains.